The Lost Caverns of Ixalan is the upcoming set for Magic the Gathering, and of course, with that, we have a lot of new spoilers here. And I really wanted to showcase some pretty cool cards and cards that I also think could be good, and some that I think will be good. And of course, the caveat here, I don't think this set was designed with the 3-year rotation in mind. It does feel like the overall power level of what we've seen so far has been low compared to what we are used to in standard right now. And it is very unfortunate. Again, it does feel like some of these cards are very, like, look really fun to play, look cool, look good. But when you compare them to what we currently have available in standard, it doesn't feel like they make the cut. And I think that is very sad when you think about the overall design of a set. It's unfortunate for the people who designed the set itself. Now, I might be wrong. Maybe this set was designed with standard in mind, but I feel like if it was, it's probably a fail. But we don't have all the cards, so I could very well be wrong. But that's my first impressions on what we've seen so far. So today I have 13 cards that I want to go through, starting with this 2/1 legendary creature in a black-white. So it costs 2 mana, and it has an instant speed. Sacrifice another creature or artifact, and you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And I think this type of effect is very powerful. It has a lot of usage, especially in decks that do want you to sack a bunch of stuff, that have synergy with sacrifice effects, as we'll see with the next card I'm going to feature. But I think having an instant speed sack effect is very strong. It gives like kind of protection to your other creatures where, if they get removed and the spell has an additional effect, like a virtue, for example, well, you can just break that virtue by sacrificing that creature, and this creature gets bigger, putting a bigger target on this creature. Now, if you have other sacrifice effects, it allows you to sacrifice like a bunch of things in one turn, potentially, as we'll see with the next card. Or you can potentially steal your opponent's cards and sacrifice them at instant speed as well. So I just think this opens up a lot of things. Now, it might not have enough support currently, but it will definitely be inside a deck that will use sacrifice effects, and that has access to black-white mana. I just think this card is really cool, and it's nice to have like a really good enabler, I think, for sack, the sack archetype. The other card that kind of follows up that full sack synergy is Veto. Veto is a 4/4 for 4 in black-white as well, and it has flying. And when you sacrifice another permanent, you gain 2 if this is the first time this ability is resolved, and then if it's the second, each opponent loses 2, and if it's a third, you make a 4/3 black vampire demon creature token with flying. So that is really strong. Now, unfortunately for Veto, the ordering on the triggers is not as powerful as it could have been. If the -2 life was first, it would be a lot stronger, because that would allow you to run more aggressively and finish off your opponent with sacrifice effects instead of having to sacrifice twice for like a drain effect. The 4/3 is incredible if you manage to get it off. It represents a lot of flying power, a lot of damage, and I find this card just be really cool. Like, these kinds of effects are really nice, I think. Having like something where, you can think about like, maybe do I wait one turn to sacrifice 2 things? There's a lot of like thinking that could happen with this card. There's a lot of like straightforward as well. Like, if you have 3 things and you have that 2/1, maybe you sack them all, you get a 4/3, and you make it like a 5/4 with that 2/1. There's a lot of things that could happen with this card that is pretty cool. It's also nice that it's a vampire. It could maybe come into play. And yeah, while this might not see play, I think it's a really cool card and deserves to be showcased. Next up, we have probably the #1 candidates, I think, for best card in the set, in my opinion. It's the Great Door, which is a 3 mana artifact, legendary artifact, and it has the activated ability of drawing a card and then discarding a card. And for 4 mana, you can tap this artifact and you transform it only if there are 4 more permanent types among cards in your graveyards, which means you need a battle, you can have a land, you can have enchantment, artifact, planeswalker. I think that's about it. But if you have 4 different types, you can flip it into the core, a legendary land that you can tap, and it will add X mana of any color, where X is the number of permanent cards, this time just permanent cards, in your graveyard. So this is an incredibly ridiculous ramp land that can add immense amount of mana. Really, like, it is crazy the amount of things you can do with this, especially in standard. With we have a lot of X cost spells. We have like Invasion of New Phyrexia, we have Whitestone's Twilight, 2 that are coming off the top of my head here, as cards that can be incredibly powerful. Now, one thing to note is that this is a transform ability, which means that once you do transform, this land will be tapped, so you can't immediately use the mana. But the fact that it's mana of any color and that we do have enough build arounds that probably can make this work. Ramp is extremely dangerous in standard, especially ramp that is tied to a land that can, activate in ramp. We've seen lands like this be incredibly powerful in other formats. Now, not specifically tied to an artifact, just like lands that you play and scale off of a certain amount of prerequisites, like creatures or green mana or devotion or stuff like that. But I think this card is actually pretty easy to fulfill the conditions of, and I think the flip side is incredibly valuable. We also have cards like Silver Scrutiny, we have Deluge that can use a lot of mana for a lot of card advantage. I think there's a lot of things to do with this card, and I absolutely love its design. I am a little bit scared that this will be good though, because I don't want to see more ramp in standard when ramp is already good, and we're going to see a land that pretty much disables all counter magic. I'll talk about that in a different video maybe. But yeah, there is one card in this set that feels like should have never been reprinted. I think it's a reprint. And, it will potentially completely disable all counter magic when it comes to dealing with creature decks, which will make Atraxa even better. But yeah, okay. Anyways, we'll talk about that another time. Next, we have a 3-mana 6/6 Dinosaur in green. So finally a big Chungus in green, and a good one at that, a really good one. When it attacks, while you don't control another dinosaur, you put a stun counter on it. So if it attacks and you don't have a dinosaur, well, it won't untap the next turn. So that's the downside. But other than that, no downside. It's actually insane. 6/6, it can block. You can use it to activate other cards that need like creatures of a certain power level, like the fight rigging or stuff like that. I mean, this card just enables a lot and is a huge creature that would be incredibly powerful against mono red. That's the only reason I want to showcase it. Finally, like something I'm happy to see in green that might reinvigorate that kind of archetype. The Poet of Unity, a 3-mana 2/3, enters the battlefield. You search your library for a basic, reveal it, put it in your hand. That's already decent value. And for 5 mana, of course, it will be 1 red or white twice. So 3 and a red or white and a red or white. You exile it, return it onto the battlefield under your control, obviously, because it's yours, or its owner's control. And the first chapter of the saga you get is make 2/3/3 dinos, which is pretty good. Then you get creatures you control have tap for green, red, or white. And then you search your library for a dino card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. And lastly, your dinos you control gain double strike and trample. That's a lot for one single card to have, tied to a enter the battlefield effect that is card advantage, and very good for finding those land drops, which dinos will probably want. I don't know if dinos are going to be an archetype, but if they are, I think you would definitely consider playing Huatli in your deck, because this is quite the amount of value that you can get for a 3-drop, and I think that's pretty good. The Everflowing Well is a very subtle artifact, but one that has a lot going on. And at first, I was mostly focused on the transform side, but let's get into the front side first. So the front side is when it enters the battlefield, mill 2, then discard 2. It's an artifact which can be relevant, and then it has descend 8. So at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, it transforms, which is pretty difficult to do, but if you build your deck correctly, it is definitely doable. And it transforms into the Myriad Pools, which is a land that taps for blue. And whenever you cast a permanent spell using mana produced by this, so when it can only do it one time basically, because you can only tap this once per turn for the most part. When you use this blue mana to cast a permanent spell, up to one other permanent on your battlefield becomes a copy of that spell until end of turn. And that effect is on paper not super powerful, but I think there are too many things to think about when it comes to what you can potentially copy that could be good, that there has to be a few cards that are actually really good with this effect. It's just very difficult to think of off the top of your head, which made this card pretty difficult to value because it will not really work well with ETBs. It mostly wants like on attack triggers or just good creatures, maybe good keywords. Like there's a lot going on here, very difficult to evaluate. And at first I thought, okay, this is not that powerful of a flip. But what you have to keep in mind is that the front side by itself is already really good. It can activate the new mechanic Descended, which needs permanents to be in your graveyard, and it draws you 2 cards for 3, which is totally reasonable, right? And it's also an artifact. So there's a lot going on here that is pretty subtle, but it just does feel like the power level's there. It has a lot going on. Another blue card that seems to be really good, like really solid, is a 2-mana 2/1 with Flash. It's legendary though, and it has Flash Flying. When it deals combat damage to a player, you put a chorus counter on it, draw a card, then discard a card. If there are 4 more chorus counters on Malcolm, you may cast a discarded card without paying its mana cost. So it's a very good looting creature. It's going to be very efficient. It's going to be very good in tempo decks, very good with counter magic. It's a threat at some point, so they have to destroy it. And, if you have 4 more chorus counters, you kind of just win the game, honestly, because casting discarded cards without paying their mana cost and drawing means you're essentially drawing 2 cards off of this, which becomes absolutely ridiculous. Plus, the mana efficiency of casting it for free means you can hold your counter magic up as well on your opponent's turn. It does a lot. While it might not be as good as Fairy Mastermind, I think it is better on average. The average is your looting, which is pretty good. Fairy Mastermind sometimes doesn't do much at all, but the height of Fairy Mastermind is definitely very strong in a metagame where people are drawing sorcery speed. Bone Horde Dracosaur. I think I pronounced that right. 5 mana, 5/5 flying first strike. Now, is this as good as Goldspan Dragon? No. But it is not that far off. So flying first strike on a 5/5 is actually kind of ridiculous. That's very good defensive stats. It blocks extremely well. It's a wall, basically. It's a really good wall. They can't attack into it. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if it survives, so usually you're going to want to play this with black, like discard, preemptively remove removal spells from your opponent's hand. But if you untap, you get a lot of value. Beginning of your upkeep, exile top 2 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. If you exiled a land card this way, you make a 3/1, which is fantastic because you don't want to be drawing lands, right? So getting a creature on top of the land is very nice. And if you exiled a non-land, you make a treasure token. Both are incredibly well designed. If you get a land card, you get board presence. And if you get a spell, you get more mana to cast it. It's just very good on top of a very solid creature. Now, this card is very bad against control, I think. Well, not very bad, because if you untap, it's still good. But it's not great against removal spells, obviously. So you more so want to play this against other decks that, don't have as much removal, but that have like good board states where you can really utilize the blocking effects of this card. And overall, just good value. So I think it's pretty cool and probably pretty decent. Although, again, caveat, most of these cards I'm talking about will probably not see standard play, honestly. But you can always hope. I'm definitely huffing on the copium that this might see play because it's a pretty cool card. Spring-loaded Saw Blades is interesting. It's a card that I don't think many people have their eye on. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't really looked at other people, evaluating the cards in the set. But I think Spring-loaded Saw Blades is kind of maybe flying under the radar of some people. So, flash 2 mana, enters the battlefield, deals 5 damage to target tapped creature an opponent controls. That's not great, but 5 damage is a lot of damage. And it has flash, so it's like an instant speed removal spell. And it is on tapped creatures, which is very important because usually these types of effects can fall into the kind of restricted aspect where, it only works on attacking or blocking creatures. This doesn't have to go through that. 5 damage is extremely relevant in this metagame, so you cannot discount that. And then you have the new mechanic Craft with Artifact. So for 4 mana, you exile this artifact and another artifact you control or one from your graveyard, and then you transform it. And you transform it into a 5/5 crew 1 vehicle. And you can also tap 2 other untapped artifacts you control and it will become a creature. So instead of crewing it, if you have other artifacts that aren't creatures, it can still crew itself. That's a lot of value for something that's going to remove and then potentially come back as a good blocker or attacker to finish off the game. I think that is very solid, and this card is incredibly cool. And also, like, I don't know, I feel like the flavor is pretty nice. You have the Saw Blaze. It's pretty cool. Like, you have the Saw Blaze and you're crafting like an actual chariot with the Saw Blaze. I always love flavor in Magic the Gathering. Sometimes when I see something that is I feel like it's well thought out. Like, everything makes sense, right? The Saw Blaze deal damage and it becomes a vehicle. It's just awesome. I love this card. Very Judgmental Rock. 5 mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, if it was cast. Very important because I thought you could flicker this with Wanderer. You can't. When it enters the battlefield, so you choose a creature controlled by each player with power 2 or less, and then destroy all other creatures not chosen this way. Then you can craft with an artifact, so craft same mechanic. You exile this artifact and another one or one from your graveyard for 5 mana, and you get the Very Judgmental Rock Boy, which is a funny name, but this golem is really interesting. The first time I read it, I was like, wow, that's a very interesting effect. I don't know if it's actually as good as I thought it was, though. So 5/3 with flying. It's an artifact, obviously. Each opponent who casts a spell this turn can't attack you or planeswalkers. So if they cast a spell pre-combat, they can't attack. So they can't remove this and then attack, for example. Each opponent who attacked you or a planeswalker you control this turn can't cast spells. Essentially, what this is doing is either they attack or they cast spells. They cannot do both, which is pretty nice. But, this card, while it is cool, it does feel like, there's Sunfall in the format, and Sunfall is an exile sweeper, does not leave anything on the board, and you also get a creature. Now, the creature is less powerful, but you also don't have to pay the 5 mana here, plus the exiling of another artifact. It just seems like there's too much on this card to be effective with it. Sometimes leaving a creature with power 2 or less is totally fine. Like if you're very healthy, it's really good. And then you can flip it and just be like in a really good spot. But sometimes you really can't let that 2-power creature on the field. Like I'm thinking about like mono red, for example, where any 2-power creature could just finish you off immediately. But, in the right deck, and it's a deck I can't really imagine off the top of my head here. I can't really picture the deck, but there might be a place for this. And in that deck, it will be pretty good. That's all I have to say about it. We have our first god here, probably the only god I'm going to showcase here. I think there's a few that have not been showcased, maybe the green one or something, but that hasn't been revealed yet. But this one, a 5 mana black 4/4 flying lifelink. That's really good, honestly. Whenever it attacks, each opponent discards a card, and obviously is very well thought out. If they can't, you draw a card. And when they discard a land, which is usually what your opponent wants to do, you make a 1/1 bat with flying. So that's pretty good. And when it dies, it comes back flipped as the Temple of the Dead. Add black, so you tap for add black. And for 3 in tap, you can transform the Temple back into the god. Only if an opponent has 1 or fewer cards in hand, activate only as a sorcery. And this is probably the easiest activation prerequisite out of all the gods that I've seen. And it seems like it has the best like stats / keywords like total. Flying Lifelink is incredibly powerful. It's very good race potential. It's very good on blocks. It has an ability that synergizes very well with it, with the discard, making more bats or drawing you a card. It's just very good. It's pretty easy to bring back. Like this card is solid. Now, solid is probably not good enough for standard, let's be honest. But, I can always hope that this card sees play. Another black creature, because it's always black getting like the best cards. No, I'm just kidding. It's actually not true, I think, this time around. For now. So we have a 4 mana flying 2/4. If an opponent would lose life during your turn, they lose twice as much life. Essentially doubling all damage you deal during your turn, which is kind of ridiculous on a 2/4 flyer, which means it also deals 4 damage to your opponent when it attacks. I would have expected a card like this with text like this to be a 1/3, honestly. Just make it die to cut down, lightning strike, but as a 2/4, it is quite good. Now, of course, 4-drop slot, we all know, very contested in standard. Again, this might be one of the cards that is closer in power level to what we would want in standard, but I still think it's not quite there. But the effect is incredibly powerful. You can really put your opponent to incredibly low life totals early and then finish them off with Shield Red. Like, it's not like we don't have good finishers in black already, like that could drain, like Trespasser, Shield Red. And this is a removal magnet. Like, they have to destroy this, which means it could open up the way for Shield Red or other creatures that you might want to play after it. So something to think about. I think this actually has a chance to see play, honestly. And I would not be surprised because it is quite powerful. Now, 3 black, so for 4 mana, right? So 1 and 3 black. That's pretty steep mana cost, but you can make it work, I think, in a 2-color deck at least. So probably not in a 3-color deck, but maybe Rakdos aggro. Maybe, I don't know, like blue-black with the flying flash creatures. I don't know, something like that. Maybe, I have no idea. Or maybe just mono black. Who knows? And lastly, we have the Preacher of the Schism. It's a 2/4 with Death Touch, which is pretty damn good stats for 3-drop. Whenever it attacks the player with the most life or tied with the most life, you make a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink. So keep in mind this is a vampire and it makes more vampires, so vampire tribal, maybe. And whenever it attacks while you have the most life or are tied for the most life, draw a card and lose 1 life. So if you are tied for the most life, so if you're at the same HP as your opponent, you get both effects. Very, very good. But otherwise, if you're attacking an opponent with more life than you, which is usually going to be like aggro decks, you make a 1/1 with lifelink, good. If you're attacking an opponent where you have more life, which means you're usually attacking a control deck, you're drawing a card and losing 1 life. So very well thought out, very cool design. Now it does have a bit of a problem where this has no ETB. It's a good blocker, but it's not that good. Like it is good, but it still dies to quite a reasonable amount of removal spells. But I do like the 2/4 stat line. I feel like it dodges Lightning Strike, it dodges like the Virtue, which could be relevant, although the other 3 drops that you could play, like Trespasser, usually are fine against Virtue. But that could be relevant, something to keep in mind. It's very hard to attack into this when it's blocking, because Death Touch just trades with anything and it has more HP, so it can usually trade up for the most part. And I think this card has some potential. I don't know if it has that much of a spot in standard, because if you look at the 3-drop slot, it's extremely stacked. You have Lily, Trespasser, Glissa, the Rafine, obviously. There's a lot you could do for 3, but this card is very versatile, and that's what I appreciate about it. It's good in like every scenario other than it getting removed, but like most creatures have that. I guess not really true in standard. That's why in standard we want to try to play cards that get removed but you don't care. This card gets removed and you kind of care because it didn't do anything on ETB and it doesn't really do anything on death, right? So yeah, it's solid. That's all I have to say about that. But again, solid might not cut it in standard, but we'll just have to see. Anyways, that's going to do it for my quick preview of what's available right now. Of course, not all the cards are out. I will update you when all the cards are out on what I think the best cards are going to be. These were just a bunch of cool things that I want to showcase. So yeah, see you in the next video. If you enjoy my content and would like to help me keep making it, consider supporting me over on Patreon, where you're going to access to a bunch of bonus videos, as well as other rewards depending on the tiers. And thank you so much to all the lovely patrons that are already subscribed. I appreciate it very much. And I will see you all in the next video.